Rob, thank you so much for joining me today on the What is a Good Life podcast. Since enjoying some of our prior conversations tremendously and also admiring the variety that seems to exist in your life, I'm really intrigued to see where this conversation goes today.
Great. Well, it's lovely to be here, Mark. I'm looking forward to seeing what unfolds as well.
So, as you're aware, I simply kick this off with, is there a question you're exploring as you move through life?
Yeah, and I think there is actually. I've been reflecting upon this, and I quite liked the idea of exploring through your life. And I think for me, I don't think I ever consciously articulated it to myself, but I think if I look back at the decisions and choices I've made since quite a tender age, actually, probably since about, I don't know, age 10 or 12. The question for me, I think, is how can we make life kind of more fun, more enjoyable? Not belittling the fact that we have to do lots of things we might not want to do, but within all of the constraints that exist, how can this thing that we're doing and every part of it kind of be more enjoyable, lighter, more fun? Fun, I can't quite find the word. Fun feels a bit trivial. I think I mean it in a slightly more profound way than that. How can it be more joyful, more fitting? It feels to me that life kind of always wants to happen. That seems to me to be the story of this planet, really. That from what we know, most planets there isn't this thing called life, and here somehow it just wants to happen. And I think about that every time I look at a plant or even a tree just growing in the most ridiculous place. You kind of go, yeah, that crack in that rock is really not. But it kind of just wants to happen. And I think the human and personal version of that for me is the kind of the joy and inventiveness and playfulness of life. It's like, what can we do here? What can we do with this? So I think that my life has been driven by the pursuit of that and continues to be, and the avoidance of what you might call the deathly or the drudge. A friend of mine once described what management consultants do as high concept drudgery, which I thought was brilliant. And Peter Brook, in his fabulous book, The Empty Space, which I go back to time and again, he conjures up this idea of what he calls deathly theatre. And he's at pains to point out that that's can happen in the most illustrious and well-funded theatres as well. So the Royal Shakespeare Company could be falling into the trap of doing deathly theatre, because what he means by deathly is this thing that it lacks this quality that I'm in pursuit of, this kind of aliveness, this curiosity, sense of exploration and possibility, which isn't always kind of simply fun in the sense of kind of being fun and games, but is delightful is the word I always come back to. So that's been the pursuit and continues to be. And I think I've been blessed. I'm speaking to you from Spain. When I first came here about 30 years ago, those days I did have an office job, and somebody said to me quite early on in my first office job there, es que no tienes ningún aguante, which literally means you have no staying power, you have no persistence, you have no capacity to last. And even at the time I thought to myself, yeah, thank goodness. That it was an insult in his terms, and this was a person who had stayed so long at a company he was too expensive to fire, and he knew that, so he could kind of do nothing the whole time, which is pretty much what he did. But to me, it was a compliment. It was like, yeah. And, I once had a job selling door-to-door carpet cleaning. And on my single day in gainful employment, I sold more carpet cleaning than anybody in that firm had ever sold before. But I couldn't bear it, cold knocking on doors. And so after a day, I gave it up, even though I was quote unquote successful. So I think that's been the thing that shapes me and drives me. And it's as much a moving away as a moving towards, So if you're listening carefully, you see I can't really articulate what it is I'm moving towards, so I've got a sense of it. But I know very well what I'm trying to avoid. And I'm very apt to give things up very quickly if they have that kind of touch of deathliness, as Brooke might say.
How do you, just out of interest, do you are your antennae quite closely attuned to that sense of deathliness? Like, what might be some of the characteristics or your senses of that?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So I think I think that I have developed a sensitivity to it. I think now it's very visceral, so it's something I can just kind of feel bodily, and then the kind of the words and the intellect and stuff will catch up. I think that's probably always been the case, but I think at the time, so if I go back to when I was 20 or 25, I thought that I thought and reasoned my way to these kinds of decisions. So I think that when I left advertising, for example, I thought I'd kind of worked out that this wasn't working for me any longer. But when I look back, I realized that that rationalization was, as indeed I think all rationalizations are, a post-rationalization. I was making sense of something that I was feeling in my body much more strongly. And so now when people ask me, oh, why did you leave advertising? Not that they do very often, but I will say because of a feeling I had in my gut getting into a taxi. So that's the tell of the deathliness. It's normally, I would describe it as a sinking feeling, as a kind of slightly despairing, why do I have to be doing this now? And every atom of my body, almost entirely from the neck down, actually, the mind is sort of flapping around, but the rest of my body is going, no, get me out of here. I don't like this. I don't want to be here. So yeah, it's a very, it's not antennae. That to me as an image conjures up something that's reaching out. It's quite the opposite. It's very in here, very felt inside of me. But it kind of brooks no argument, really.
And when you said you initially kind of came to this, if you were to reflect back on it, it could have been as early as 10 or 12. Did you sense you had quite a different perspective on life, or was this supported by your environment, or how would you kind of describe that?
Well, I think I always felt very separate, very different. I always felt like I was at school from the age of 7, kind of having to play a role to fit in with the other kids. And I didn't do it very well, so I got bullied, we'd call it these days. I didn't think of it as that at the time. And part of my problem was that I could kind of do everything and do it well. And so that sort of was not a good thing in Wiltshire in the 1970s anyway. And so I always felt very separate, not quite alone, I think. I didn't feel lonely. I had friends and stuff, but I felt separate. And I think through my teenage years that progressed as well. I think I remember when kids started smoking at school and I could see that they thought they looked cool and I just thought they looked stupid. So I always felt kind of apart and outside. I was probably quite kind of boring as a teenager, I think, quite nerdy in some ways, and yet I was good at sport, so that was kind of weird as well. So yeah, I think I've always felt kind of as an outsider, or that I don't really belong, and that I think I've probably cultivated that over time. And yet periods in my life where I've kind of gone, oh, okay, this is the game we play, and we play it like this for this reason, and we present ourselves in this way. But I think when the chips are down, what was really interesting about that guy, who was an art director, the guy I mentioned in Spain, is that he wasn't wrong. He was actually very perceptive. He could see, even after about 2 months working together, that there was something in me that was slightly on its own path. And, I think that's always been a strong thing. And I think when I make decisions that other people at the time described to me as crazy or mad, they seem totally obvious to me. So like leaving London at a point when everything was ostensibly going very well, or moving halfway around the world to live and work, to live with my now wife, and to abandon any sense of my own work or career, which weirdly led to a fantastic and interesting opportunity, or starting a business with somebody the first time I met him, or beginning that process anyway on first meeting. And all these things kind of seemed quite ordinary to me. And I think because a couple of them paid off big time, if you like, doing the unusual thing, leaving London brought me a new language, a new culture, a place to live, the main relationship of my life, and all the riches that come with it. And because that happened before the age of 30, I think 30 is kind of a threshold before I had dependence and responsibilities. I mean, I'd had a house in London because it was the 80s, because that's what you did, but you could sell it at a profit and use that to finance your travel and stuff. So it then became easier and easier to do that kind of unusual thing. And because it kind of had worked for me, and so I think that just got kind of more and more so. So yeah, I think I've always felt kind of an outsider or a satellite or somehow separate.
That the way you described that of, you know, making what could be considered crazy or unusual decisions to maybe people looking on from the outside, and that just felt very ordinary to you. Can you give me a sense of just like the commitment you mentioned to your wife or meeting a business partner? Like, can you give me a sense of just how that felt so ordinary versus how it may have been perceived?
Um, yeah, I mean, let's take the business example. I mean, it's funny actually. I'm kind of wearing the T-shirt that came from that ultimately. But the context was I'd stepped in for somebody to do a talk for Nike, a very exclusive thing they did called Design Camp. And I was given this horrible brief, which is you need to be sort of profound and funny at the same time. And by the way, this is an incredibly cool audience. They're a really tough crowd, And so the only way I knew to be sure to be funny was to make a speech or a talk that wove together lots of bits of brilliant British comedy. Actually, so I used bits of Blackadder and I used quite a lot of Whose Line Is It Anyway? The talk was about creative problem solving, and so improvisation and how improvisers do that was kind of in my mind. And then I met this guy to talk about a T-shirt. So he'd done some public art, and I found some T-shirts of his on a stall. And some of my work at the time involved training, and I'd also worked out that you could make an expensive piece of corporate training a lot more likely to succeed by giving them a really cool T-shirt. So I thought, I could get this guy to do some original T-shirts, handmade art. That'd be great. So I met him to talk about T-shirt, but just by way of introduction, he said, "Oh, I do, as well as the public art, I do this improv thing." And because I've just come from this talk, it seemed the most natural thing in the world to go, "Oh, how does that work?" And he started talking about it, and I could feel that it was very resonant with a field I'd been investigating for many years, which is the science of complexity, of messiness, if you like, what I think of as the science of everyday life, and so. And I'd had some attempts to use that body of thought in the kind of corporate training thing, which had failed miserably. And so it just felt the most natural thing to pursue this line of inquiry with this guy. And as he was talking, I thought, oh yeah, this feels like it could be more fun and playful than this science stuff, even though it's drawing on the same wellspring. And so I just said to him, could you do that for a whole bunch of advertising people in a conference in Tempe, Arizona in March? And he said, yeah, sure. And I later discovered, of course, that's the improviser's response, is to say yes, right? And he was slightly flipping in his head, but he didn't show it, and that's Gary Hirsch, who's one of my closest friends now. And so it just felt like I just followed the breadcrumbs, like the natural thing to do. Oh, that's interesting. Why do you do that? How do you do that? Oh, it's about practice. Okay. Could anybody do that? Yeah. Could you run a workshop? Yeah. And you just take that next step. And I think that's the thing people often say to me, and I imagine they might say the same to you. It's like, oh, how do you meet so many interesting people? And my question is kind of opposite. It's like, how do you not? But I realized that it's like once you set off on a certain path where you have a certain richness of network, you do something to help that happen, which is you just take the next step. You just kind of go, oh, I'll call him then. I'll let him know. Why don't we fix to speak? Or let's have a coffee. And lots of people actually just don't do that. And I can now, as an author, I feel it on the receiving end. I can feel that attitude in the people who write to me. And there must be lots of people who would like to write to me, but who don't. And quite often those connections lead to fantastic relationships for both parties, So I think there's a kind of willingness to take that extra step, but it feels natural. What doesn't, if I contrast it with the sort of opposite, it's like I'm not sitting there assessing how good is this guy, what's this going to work. I'm not paying any attention to anything other than my curiosity and my interest. And actually, it's funny because Gary and I, this is the guy I'm talking about with whom I started the improv business, however long ago it was now. We kind of rediscovered this just last year. We spent some time together, and it kind of came out of a conversation between us that follow the energy is just a fabulous mantra. and useful to him on stage, but also useful in everyday life. And I think that's what we did in that first conversation. And it was good to rediscover it because it's a reminder that the energy we're talking about is the energy that flows, the energy that feels alive and vibrant and that draws you in, the brightness, not which is very different from kind of trying to force the machine. It's contrasting kind of quality from the shoulds and oughts, which come with a sense of obligation and duty. And normally one finds that shoulds and oughts you've kind of inherited either from a peer group or from a societal expectation, or sometimes from a pattern in early life. At the moment, one of the things I'm most interested in, for me, as a specific question that's alive now, is how to not let the little boy that wants to be the good boy, that wants to be diligent and to be seen to be diligent and do the right thing, because that's also part of me as well, quite strongly, and how to not let that personality or that persona, if you like, dominate where it's not appropriate. So, but yeah, following the energy, and I guess learning to perceive that energy, because it'll be different for everybody. It's not an absolute,
Yeah.
it's not an objective thing. It's like what speaks to you.
There's something you're talking about there actually touches on something I was just writing this morning around the sense of what a past guest had mentioned, that if they can trust that they are in the right place where they are, where they're supposed to be, and that there seems to be some presence of possibility or openness, their idea of resilience is profoundly affected by that. And, even when you mentioned earlier the sense of fun, but fun doesn't mean that it's only all this perfectly joyful continuous experience. Things will arise that you have to deal with, but when that trust and that openness is there, the resilience is almost a byproduct of it. It's more a kind of harnessing the power of life rather than going, trying to walk back upstream against life. There's also a beautiful absence of thought almost in. Do you know what I mean? Like in just you
Absolutely.
and this interaction and going, can you do this in Arizona? Sure. Like, yeah, why not? Like, it's there's something in it where, as you say, I definitely get a very strong sense you're tapping into, whether it is that notion of following the energy, but there's definitely something where I think there's just a trust in life almost, or there's not, even when you mentioned about reaching out to people, there's almost like an absence of, or not a, there's no hang up of consequence to it. Like you can try this and whatever happens happens. I think when we're kind of connected to that, it doesn't feel as personal, like, oh, if they say no to me, what does that say about me? It's just like, no, this is the energy and I'll follow it, and whatever the outcome is feels somehow to me less personal. That idea though of the little boy, man, that's such a it's so intriguing though, even from just even what you've said about your own life so far, and even some of the things that we've talked about before, and just the choices you've made and the way you've gone about life, and it's seeming very much your own path. Can you describe the presence of that that little boy, or the idea that he needs to be doing the right things or the appropriate thing, and just how that kind of plays out in the context of still what seems a life where you've carved you're carving your own way as well, if you get me.
Yeah, it's interesting. Funny enough, it feels like a contraction, and sometimes it's a visible contraction. So I've had friends that know me well, kind of go, oh, you've gone small and tight. You can see it in my body, and I think that's how it feels within. And I think that the I wrote about this recently in a very particular setting. I might as well use this example. So uh, it this I'd been holding this idea that the kitchen worktop needed sanding and oiling, and but what was interesting is the motivation was the little boy's motivation. So if I unpack that feeling, why do I feel that at all? Because no one else in the family cared or even noticed. But there's something in me. It's like what makes it small. It's like there's something I'm small and there's some voice or presence or something outside of me that is somehow looking down on me or looking at me, judging me, something that's from outside of me that is holding to me some kind of standard. And obviously, this is all me, but how it feels is that it's outside of me. And so the should or the ought is born out of that. So I don't look at the worktop and think, oh God, I'd love to do some woodwork. I kind of, I get tight, I get small, and it feels kind of hectoring. And in this particular instance, because I've been paying attention to this, I was able to notice that and somehow interrupt it. Don't ask me how. That's if I knew that, then we'd really be onto something. But anyway, somehow I was able to interrupt that and go, oh, how if I chose to act from somewhere else? How if I got curious about what would it take to do that well, or might it be interesting just to do, or and actually to focus almost on the work. In this case, I mean by the work, the sanding and oiling. Although you could kind of ladder that up to the kind of internal work as well. How would it be to just do that for its own sake? And then what happened was like all of a sudden the feeling expands again. So it's going whoosh, and there's an opening and a softening. And now I can really lean into the curiosity and go, oh, okay, so and I'm not very good at these kinds of things. So instead of in the former mode, there's a kind of like, better do it like, be careful, you could make it worse, you might mess it up, maybe you shouldn't do it at all. All that kind of discourse going on. And then there's a kind of like, oh, have I got the right kind of, do I need a different kind of sandpaper? And does it matter if it's 120 grid or 150 grid for the final pass? And so I'm just sort of curious and in it. And of course, and then I do it in an unhurried way. I do it in a relaxed way. I'm curious about the result. And of course, the result, I say of course, but it seems ironic and amusing that the result is superb, of a kind of quality that I wouldn't normally expect that I myself might attain. And I'm sure that's not unrelated because of the attitude I've come to it. So it's this kind of, so my point is that from the outside, I might do exactly the same thing, but I'm not doing it from this place of small, tight judgment. I'm doing it from a place of kind of openness and curiosity. So even in the same set of actions, there's a different way of kind of coming into something. And that now I've started to notice. That was a few weeks ago. Kind of on a daily basis with, whatever I'm doing, the most trivial thing. Like I did my accounts yesterday. And Johnny Moore, a friend of mine who I think you know as well, has this great idea of doing your books is effortless if you can find your way into bookkeeping mind. And for me, bookkeeping mind is a rare occurrence. But I think yesterday, instead of feeling that I should do my accounts, which I really did feel because my administrator has been banging on at me for months and I'm way behind, so the normal kind of thing. But instead of doing it from that place again of tightness and closeness and getting irritated when, oh, that doesn't tally with that, so now I have to go and look at this, and now that platform wants a password that I can't remember. You get down this horrible administrative rabbit hole of just bureaucratic technological gunge. And instead of reacting it to like that, I kind of come into it in this softer way and kind of go, oh, maybe if I just set that password properly and if I do it with the fingerprint, then I won't have to do it again. And actually, that wasn't that hard. And so there's a sort of, it's softening, I think, is the kind of the quality of this inner shift. And the opportunity to practice or play around with that is kind of, many times a day on big and small and bigger scales.
It's when you mention that sense of the good little boy. I was back in Ireland for a week, a few weeks back, and I just had a great trip, and it was a very simple trip, but it was a mixture of family, friends, walks and places that I really enjoy, and just feeling very much at ease in the family home at this point in life as well, and still it was very interesting. I noticed just the almost like the weight of, and nobody was saying this to me, like there was no direct approach to me, and it didn't even feel subversive, if you know what I mean. Like didn't seem like there was any attempts to just say the thing you wanted, but instead of saying it directly to me, to somebody else. And I noticed that I was sometimes when I go back to Ireland, I'm almost living, or I'm almost feeling the weight that I think was of the life that was expected of me, or to have made some of the choices that would have been expected of me. And I don't know if it doesn't feel like anything personal. It's almost just that that I can momentarily experience that, even in a week, which I thought was absolutely delightful. I think it's fascinating, just some of the energies that we still carry, even in the face of an awareness of them or a noticing of them. But as you just kind of mentioned there, it also offers a contrast to move between these energies of, let's say, even contracting into softening. So there, I don't know, it would almost seem a bit less rich or something if these energies didn't exist, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I think it would be impossible. I think they're always going to be there. I think, we're not individuals. We're made in a context. We're of a context. Our physical bodies, our kind of psychological, emotional makeup emerges from a rich web of relationships. And even that language is a bit misleading because it can suggest that there was a period of formation and then it's made. I mean, actually, it'd be much more accurate, I think, much more helpful, perhaps, if a bit more clumsy, to talk always in the gerund, so that we are constantly a coming forth and emerging. But early experience, because we're in a very, very plastic period for a number of years, if you like, is disproportionately influential. And instead of thinking of early experiences, they fuck you up, your mum and dad. Uh, if we substitute the verb, they make you up, your mum and dad. And for mum and dad, let's understand, the entire context, the family, the relationship, the web of relationships, the pueblo, as we would say here. It takes a village to make a person, So instead of sort of feeling resentful, as Philip Larkin was in that poem, and kind of blaming parents, just to acknowledge and understand that's how we are and who we are and how we are made. And therefore, it makes total sense that there are things which served us really, really well and which we didn't necessarily choose and weren't conscious of, that have become part of us. And as times move on and our context change and our interests and our desires and our capabilities all kind of wax and wane and evolve and mix, then some of those things no longer serve us in quite the same way. And so to revisit them and notice them, and to be then in a process of going, oh, well, maybe I could just understand that. Maybe I could let some of it go, and that would afford me some space for something else. But to not sort of attach a value judgment to accept in a deep sense, and to then get a kind of curious about that and kind of go, oh, that's really interesting. I think it's perhaps it's a bit too easy to think about we want to change ourselves or want to make ourselves better. I think if 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 we were to think of, can I understand myself, that might actually also bring about a change, but would almost be enough. It's like, I mean, I used to teach people to juggle, and actually what's really interesting is juggling's made up of two fundamental skills, throwing and catching, but they're asymmetric, because if you throw the ball in the wrong place, you just can't catch it. Um, uh, so so you need to work on the throws. And what I found was much more helpful to people was to just have them notice the throws, not to try and correct the throws. So don't judge your throws as bad, but just notice, oh, look, the throws from my left hand, they go 3 meters away. So that'll be hard to catch. And so just do the act of noticing, and then allow, often the self-correction comes into play. And maybe sometimes self-correction isn't sort of necessary. Juggling is obviously a very rudimentary skill where you've got a kind of an easy listón, I would say in Spanish, like a bar of what's good and not so good. In life in general, maybe it's not even about self-correcting, but even if what you want is to kind of improve or get better, maybe just the noticing and understanding that, yeah, we came from a place, and we're complex and we're fluid, and to get curious with that, and then to allow things to kind of unfold or shift rather than struggling and pushing. And that takes me to absolutely agree with what you said about when you're in the right place, and when it feels like things fit, things flow, and it's effortless. And effortless, again, isn't quite the right word. It's like, effort's not the issue. It would be a better way of putting it, I think. Because I don't like that idea of efforting and being effortful. I just think effort's not the dimension when you're in that right place. And I think, for me, increasingly kind of what life does in a biological sense, so biological life, looking at nature, looking at organisms, I think is a really useful place for me personally to look. And when I look there, I think one of the most powerful ideas is fit. Fit as in fitting into. And, I think it's one of the biggest miscomprehensions in history, and the idea of the survival of the fittest. It wasn't actually Darwin that said that, as I understood it. It was Huxley. And actually, the sense in which it was meant by Darwin was the fitting into, fit as in a jigsaw puzzle, not fit as in strong. And so, what biological organisms do, if you look at Galapagos finches, which is where obviously Darwin came up with the idea of evolution, the most fit finches are those with bigger beaks or smaller beaks, depending on how much it's rained and what kind of seeds are available. And that varies season by season, month by month, even day by day. And so it's not that a big beak is a stronger beak is better. It's that it's how it fits. And so I think what nature's always looking for is to make the most of what fits here. What can we do with what we've got? And I think that's, to me, why when you find yourself in the right place, everything does feel like it fits and it flows. And oh, look, we can do that. And yeah, sure, let's go to Arizona and do a workshop. Why not? Because you've got that improv thing and that works with this complexity thing. And that let's see how that goes. But not to stop there and then think, aha, now we've got it. Make it, fix it, anchor it, but to kind of go, and what's next? What comes next? What comes next? And so that's where to me leads very quickly to the idea of practice, of being in a practice of constant iteration, and noticing and asking oneself, what else can I be curious about? What else is here? What else can I do with this? What and simple lessons, simple motifs or mantras that you can, where the novelty and the particularity is brought by the context, so that you don't need to feel, I don't need to read the internet before I can start, just like start where you are, the first step, as the poet David Whyte says, start close in, start here.
You said something earlier, the observation that life wants to happen. The more you observe life itself, even outside of you. And then this notion of, a curiosity and an understanding seems far more beneficial, perhaps, than a desire to change in a particular preset, with a preset idea of what that change ought to be. And there's something about, and then the practice, it seems very much for yourself, is the living of this. It's not this stuff could sound quite abstract if life choices were, if the way in which we move in life or in the world weren't an embodiment of this as well. Just really interested from your point of view, because for me, while I initially came into a lot of lines of inquiry from the point of view of meditation and different things like this, and even therapy initially, or going to therapy and reflecting on myself and behaviors, and trying to get a an understanding of a story almost, I found a huge amount of relief in almost in just observing how nature might work, or the transience of the world around me, rather than an understanding of my story. I'm curious from your perspective, just some of the observations when you observe life itself. What influence would you say they've had in in bringing this, as you say, kind of closer to yourself?
Um, well, I think it was a huge liberation, a discovery for me to realize that physics is on this path too. So, I come from a family of engineers and doctors and teachers. And so, kind of, there is a part of me which is quite interested in kind of rigor and discipline and order. And I think that, when I discovered, it was the book, The Tao of Physics, I read by Fritjof Capra, that actually there's this confluence between Eastern mysticism and Western science when you get down into the detail of what is sometimes referred to as the daddy science. So nobody can say physics isn't kind of like proper stuff. You can say that about economics, but not about physics. Um, uh, But so I think that kind of realization, if you like, at a point in my life when I was getting more increasingly interested in what you might think of as the mystic, and to realize that there was this confluence, then enabled me to start finding examples in everyday life, both at the kind of human level and in nature and biology, as you say, of where, if you like, when I say what life wants to happen, what I mean is that there is order and pattern in this world, in the world that I appreciate. I look out the window, I look at the plants and the flowers and the trees, and they are ordered. They're not random, but they're not ordered in an industrial, linear, rigorous, sharp, uniform, standard way. And that's a hallmark for me of what is alive. So if I go back to Peter Brook again, this revelation about Death Through Theatre came to him on his first day as a theatre director, where in those days, in the early 60s, a theatre director would have basically prepared an enormous tome of instructions for actors. Stand here, say this, look like this, do this. And as he set the whole machinery, and that was the word I think he used, in motion, he said he had a fundamental choice, either to throw that away and start again, or to try and then control the hell out of it. And of course, he chose the former. And I think that, so for me, I think, this sense of pattern and order, so it's not random and chaotic, but neither is it standard and uniform. And I think it's interesting for me. I'm in Madrid at the moment, but I've lived for the last 20 something years on a hillside about 100 miles away from here, surrounded by oak trees. And I think, our house has many, many windows, and kind of everywhere you look, there's oak trees, basically. And yet they're all clearly oak trees, but they're all different. And I often wonder, is it looking at those trees every day? That's the everyday experience, the thing I'm accessing, which is showing me how nature works. So because it's on a hillside, there's one particular oak tree, I remember, where it's growing down, which, trees are meant to grow up, but actually they grow towards the light. And if you're on a hillside and there's no trees below you, there's light available down. So there's this one so it's still an oak tree, but it's doing the thing that you do if you're an oak tree in that spot, with the light is as much below you as it is above you, is you do something else whilst still being an oak tree, And I think in the human world, I think we suffer from our success. We've had just such extraordinary success with the standardization and the uniform. It's basically the whole modern era is built on it. But you see, that's interesting, because if you track that back, you go, and that's all based on Newtonian mechanics. But I read a biography of Wren once that explained that him and, I think it was Robert Boyle or Robert Hooke, I can never remember which, they had a bet. So they're in Wiltshire, where Christopher Wren is from, same as me actually. And they have this bet about whether the planets move in ellipses or in circles. And then they go, well, Isaac will know. So they head off to Cambridge to go and see Isaac Newton and to settle the bet. Do the planets move in circles? They move in ellipses. And Newton immediately kind of goes, well, ellipses, obviously. And they kind of, but they're good mathematicians and good astronomers. They go, okay, then where's the proof? And he says, I've got it around here somewhere. And they can't find it. He's worked it out, he can't find it. Chaotic kind of, rooms in Cambridge. And he says, don't worry, I'll do it again. And what he did again was his magnum opus. That was the Tractatus. So you kind of go, wow, all of the edifice of modern technology founded on Newtonian mechanics and that kind of rigorous mathematics and that idea that we can control and understand things by taking them to pieces and measuring everything with precision, all came from a bet. It just sort of feels funny to me. Now, you could argue, well, somebody else would have discovered it and Leibniz was on the same path and, whatever. And I'm sure that's true. But at the same time, that interplay, and not to belittle that way of thinking and being, but it feels to me like we've got so much benefit from it. It's been so successful that we've forgotten that it's a way of understanding and organizing information. It's a way of approaching the world, not the way. It's not the truth. That the oak trees have their own truth, and they'll grow down if that's where the light is, and that nature has this way of patterning, so it's not random and chaotic. As an aside, my own personal view is that nature read in tooth and claw. That kind of interpretation of Darwinism as a constant competition, I think, is an oversimplification. And again, when I look at nature, I see far more evidence for intense kind of symbiotic collaboration and coordination and that competition in a pure sense happens only at the margins. It's not the dominant kind of discourse. And so I think that, basically with this way of thinking we've had that's been so successful, it's in an era of diminishing returns, and we don't want to abandon it. It's still incredibly useful for certain things at a certain level of scale. But from a philosophical perspective, to think that that's how the world is to miss much of what, human history is telling us. Because back to the Tao again. So the Tao of physics, the Taoists arguably knew what the physicists have discovered, if you like, by coming through a different door, which is that everything is a dance and everything is relationship. And actually there is no stuff. That stuff is not an illusion. It's not that it's false, but stuff is a phenomenon that crops up. Hard things like this table crop up at a certain level of scale, but the table is mostly space. And if you go deep enough into it, it's mostly, well, there's nothing there really. There's a pattern of probabilities. And so, these old traditions have been showing us that for a long time, and humanity has veered back over this way. And I think that, our collective future really depends upon not jettisoning what we've learned through what I think of as kind of the Enlightenment and its consequences, but nuancing it and understanding the complementarity of other ways of thinking and being that other stories and other traditions have been exploring in a very rigorous way, sometimes for thousands of years. And that these aren't, it's ironic, of course, that the kind of Newtonian way of thinking tends to oppose things. So we kind of go, either it's this, and Newton was right, and all that flows from it, and the rest is kind of flaky poppycock. Whereas actually, a kind of, an and view of it would say, no, the mechanics and the physics of Newton is helpful and true at one level, and so is a much more patterned, mysterious, mystic kind of reality when looked at a different level. And even the physicists agree about that.
How do you, just from your perspective, I'd love to know, like, how do you sense that this has become so compelling, that the idea of competition is so kind of rife? I was watching a documentary, some nature documentary, and all I know, I can't remember the name of it, but Morgan Freeman was narrating it, and I was kind of astounded. It was kind of charting the history of life on this planet, and I was kind of astounded by the fact that I can't remember. It could have been 15 minutes in, and so much of it was about dominating, dinosaurs ruling the earth. So the competition or friction or fight. I think there was around seven words of that type that were used in the first 15 minutes. And from your perspective, and I know you're saying how effective this has been at scale, but when you consider your capacity, or when you observe it, just that you see this deep collaboration or dance or relationship, how is it you think that we become so enamored by this idea of it being competitive and each for ourselves, and this type of notion?
Okay, there's a number of bits to the response. So one is go back to the late 17th century and try and imagine how it felt for somebody to wake up one morning and have a member of your family turn out to have died.
Right.
Like totally mysteriously, So if we put ourselves in that mentality, the promise of understanding, control, certainty, huge, And so philosophers like Descartes, Newton in his own way, what Descartes set out to pursue was certainty. That was his method. It was like, what can I be absolutely certain of? So it goes a long way back, and that desire was understandable at the time, and yielded fabulous results. If you just look at the history of public health, let alone medicine or technology and industry, how is work done? Look at the progress we've made in how work gets done. So it seems to kind of promise kind of endless riches and kind of just be able to sort of supply our every need and want. So there's that sort of historical part of it. To answer more specifically the question, I did some work with the Natural History Unit of the BBC over a number of years with their leadership team, which was predominantly women at the time I worked with it. And yet they used the language of silverbacks and alpha males, even in the leadership team meetings. And this is a bit of a stretch, perhaps, and I'm going to speak ill of a national treasure, so this will probably have me deplatformed forever. But David Attenborough, let's get it right. David Attenborough, who is, an absolute genius in many ways. He came to drama. He came to natural history from drama. He had been head of drama at BBC Two, I think, in the early 60s. And I saw a documentary once about how this all began. And he was basically sent off to Asia for six months with a cameraman and film guy and a certain amount of film and told to make something. I mean, what an amazing opportunity that was. So it's, if you like, the progenitor of what we now understand to be the specific genre you're referring to, of the kind of the nature documentary, which Attenborough in particular and the BBC in general kind of have cast the mold for that. Everybody has learned from them and kind of owes them a debt. And so because he came from a drama background and because he understood how television works, drama works on telly. And the drama is the conflict. So that's the bit you dramatize. That's how you tell the story. That's how you make it come to life. The collaborative bit, which is obviously implicit in all of what they're portraying anyway, and they do talk about that as well. But it's actually much less. It's just less good telly, and so it doesn't take pride of place. And perhaps when this kind of model gets outside of the BBC, perhaps people aren't quite as punctilious or as careful kind of about that kind of balance and that kind of sensitivity. And I remember if you talk to serious scientific ecologists, they'll, somebody I met at Schumacher College in Devon talking about how really pure competition is quite hard to find in nature. So, but what's happened is because it's so successful, then it becomes part of our industrial discourse that all of business is talking about that. So I do a lot of games in workshops with senior leaders, and many of the games I play are what James Cast would call infinite games, not finite games. So they're games where you play to have an experience, and life obviously is an infinite game. Not that life is infinite, but that it's there's no set periods. There's no it's ebbing and flowing. So these games I play are often to see what happens. And the only question I'm really interested in is what happened for you as we were playing that game. What did you notice? What did you observe about yourself? What happened in the group? And often people who are steeped in this kind of culture of winning and losing will say, well, how do you win this game? And I'll say, well, maybe winning's not the point. And they go, well, that's the whole point. And so that's how it shows up. It's so ingrained in our culture because it's been so successful. And then the drama on the television kind of locks in because you need eyeballs, and it makes it kind of, and so it all sort of seems to work. So you have to pay quite close attention to not fall prey to that. And this takes us back to what I was talking about earlier about, we're formed by our context as children, but also as adults, we continue to be formed by our context. And so if that's what everybody's doing and saying and paying attention to and giving importance to, then if you're not kind of a little bit rebellious, or if there's not something in you that you notice. So the feelings I was talking about earlier that I noticed, that feeling getting in a taxi that led me to leave advertising, maybe I have more of those feelings than other people. Maybe I'm less conformist, but maybe other people have them and dismiss them. I know I did for a while. I kind of like, oh no, that can't be right. Look at everyone around me. We're meant to be doing this. And this idea of there is a way of doing things, so that is the right way to do it. I think that the slip from the indefinite article to the definite article, this is a truth, to this is the truth, is an easy one to make and is legion. It's everywhere, And I think science has a problem now with scientism, where people will say, well, science is the only truth. Personally, I've always believed, one of the things that was formative for me was reading Karl Popper at the tender age of 17. And Popper basically argues that science amounts to best guess yet. That's my interpretation of falsificationism. That science just tells you this is our best guess until it's proved wrong, and it will be, and then it gets proved wrong again and again and again. And that doesn't just happen with big paradigm shifts. That happens all the time on a day-to-day basis in science, amongst people actually doing science. Whereas the sort of the public discourse around science is that it gives us the truth, whereas it really doesn't, I think, unless you're not doing your philosophy homework. And I think that leads to all sorts of problems, because then if you think about politics, then it kind of people have the answer. Or even in advertising, right? It's hilarious. In advertising, we used to go and present a campaign to a client that we would describe as, this is the right campaign. And the client would say, no, I don't like that, or they'd bomb it out for some reason. And lo and behold, we'd go back 6 weeks later, because this was the 1980s. In those days, you got 6 weeks to do these things. With another campaign, which would also say was the right campaign, and we wouldn't do that with any awareness or irony. We did it with a sense of sort of blind zeal and conviction that might have been very convincing at one level, but was totally implausible at another. And I think that that's a very easy trap to kind of fall into. I think it was Fitzgerald, wasn't it? He said that the sign of first-rate intelligence is the capacity to hold two conflicting ideas at once. And I think a lot of my work now, and the thing I'm interested in, is how do we create and cultivate the spaces where different perspectives, opinions, understandings, experiences can be shared and held, and not necessarily resolved. It's not like we're trying to come out with a solution or an action point, where we are all informed by each other, and we all are in a process of forming ourselves and being formed by the other people that we are also forming. So, and that feels to me biological.
Because otherwise, it seems, the way you mentioned the idea that life is an infinite game, and otherwise, it feels like we're trying to, I don't know, creating an end point within something that is ongoing.
Yeah,
And
and I get that, practically speaking, you need to have sort of pro tem, you need to have kind of timelines and temporary stuff like that. But the thing I think is really ironic about that goal setting, which again is another part of what I think of as the kind of mechanical way of proceeding, is that by definition, if you think it through, if you need to define your goal in advance, then the only thing that you can have as goals are those things that you can imagine or see as possible when you begin. Almost everything in my life that has happened that has been joyful, expansive, enriching, and I mean that economically as well, I couldn't possibly have imagined. So I could not have imagined starting an improv-based business as a kind of consultancy, because I didn't know it was even possible. And yet we kind of did that. And it's 30 years old now and still prospering. And so if you, for kind of more menial things, for lower order things, I get, there's people doing asphalt on the road outside. It's probably good that they've got a set of objectives about when they're going to finish and how much material they need. But if you're interested in the things that bring us alive, the things that spark our imagination, that make us feel that we're really living, then if you could define it in advance and set a goal to achieve that, then that wouldn't be much of a life, really. I mean, Margaret Heffernan talks about this, where she says that if all of life were predictable and sure, and it was just a process of meeting goals that you'd already articulated, then life amounts to no more than waiting for the train. And I would argue that actually that's not anything that we would recognize as a life. That what we recognize as a life, and when you ask people to tell a story, say, of something that brought them alive, like a great holiday or a great vacation, they will almost always tell you something that in some way transcended, surpassed, or flipped their expectations or what they were anticipating. That delight in the going kind of beyond. And so what I think is beautiful here, and I think what my kind of work is, if I go back to the original question, kind of my current expression of how do we make life more fun, let's just use that word, is to create context where we can discover and learn things we didn't know we were capable of.
yeah.
And what's really interesting about that is that's not a process just of hoping and crossing your fingers. That actually, again, as biology shows us, you can do really sensible, thoughtful, careful things to prepare the ground. You can till the soil. You can make sure that there are nutrients in it. You can water it, and you can plant the seed. But it's the seed that does the growing. It's the seed that knows if it's a tomato or an aubergine or a courgette. And actually how it knows that is deeply mysterious to biologists even today. So there's sensible, intelligent things we can do. It's the same in improv. There are things that you can do, things that you can pay attention to, efforts you can make that will make the chance of a good story and a satisfied audience more likely. You just don't know what the particulars will be. And if you try and set the goals in advance, you limit what's possible. So you like kind of, when Gary, it's interesting, Gary, my partner in the improv business, he began doing improv theatre because he had a terrible memory. So it drove him nuts that he had to learn a script and learn lines. And then he blundered across this improv thing. And uh, if you like, what he discovered was that instead of there being one correct path, which is constituting success, now there's an infinite number of paths that could be successful in different ways. And you just need to discover what they are. So the kind of, you've gone from one right path and an infinite number of wrong paths to an infinite number of wrong paths, right paths, and no wrong paths really yet, kind of because you've got a chance to kind of keep working on it. And that's what I think nature is doing the whole time. So it's sort of saying, oh, right, when I think they discovered bacteria alive in the fission chamber of a nuclear reactor because nature's like, oh, radioactivity. Oh, that's a bit weird. What do we do with this? And if you look at Chernobyl or the DMZ, as they call it, between the two Koreas where human beings haven't been around, I mean, Chernobyl's more interesting, so toxic in one sense, and yet certain forms of life, not all forms of life, but certain forms of life, wildly abundant because actually it turns out we're the most noxious thing around, not the radioactivity. So not to be down on humanity, but it's just to say that, nature will find a way. It finds a kind of, it's like, what have we got here? Let's work with that.
But that sentiment again of life wants to happen, there's almost this, well, there's not almost, there's an inevitability that it will happen. And just when you mentioned there that sentiment of you could try and plot this out and say these are the goals ahead of time, and that's all you could imagine. I remember when I met my wife almost 10 years ago, we met in India, traveled around for a little bit, and then went to Nepal for a week. And there I proposed to her. We did hang gliding. We got bumped up to business class. So a bunch of different things that you think might be memorable happened. Um, and the thing that we both remembered the most, or the warmest memory we have from that trip, is waiting for a bus from Kathmandu to Pokhara, having done no research, and then weren't sure of what bus to get on. No one really able to help us, and we just thought, "Fuck it, we'll grab a beer in this kind of corrugated roof tin establishment that had a couple of benches and a dust floor." And my wife, who didn't have great English at the time, spoke a little bit in German. I spoke in English, and the guy who was serving us didn't understand us either. He was speaking some form of Nepalese, and we just, like, lots of backslapping and laughter. And that's honestly the happiest moment I had on the trip. Whereas you could think it would be the things that you could say were like that you might want to happen. And
Yeah.
I don't know, I always think that's profoundly interesting for me, just in terms of, like, for to have that curiosity as to what is happening now, because we can be slaves to the ideas of what's coming next. But as you say, not in some sense where we disown the mind or make it subordinate to everything and till the soil and everything else, but life will have a habit of just happening. Rob, just from all you discussed, even the idea of, like, how can we make life more fun, essentially, um, ideas around exploring liveliness, the kind of not looking to encounter or moving away from those moments of deathly theater, and noticing the internal feelings below the neck of getting into a taxi and realizing, oh, this isn't for me, to this lovely notion of moving towards a kind of a more trusting and more thoughtless kind of way of engaging with things that feel right when the energy is there, whether that's engaging with Gary in a work sense, even when you mentioned moving and pursuing the relationship with your wife, acknowledging that even along this path there's still energies and the context and environment of what we are growing up in, like appearances of the good little boy, but also noticing again this almost this softening towards some of these rigid energies that we sometimes feel, this constant kind of, or this lived curiosity, whether that's observing nature, observing your own reactions to things, even in the work you do, asking people to notice their own experiences and to notice what's happening in relation to us, moving away maybe kind of more from the cultural ideas of competition, but into life being a collaboration, a dance, this relationship that we're in. Really curious to ask you, Rob, the question of what is a good life for you?
To me, I think a good life is where I feel. So I think it's about feeling, not thinking, even though I like to think. I think it's about feeling a sense of unfolding possibility. That there's something about, I love that verb unfolding. I think, and again, just to get back to biology for a moment, I mean, DNA is it's the folds as much as the sugars. It's like how those infinitely long chains. I mean, they'd reach to the moon apparently. The DNA in every cell of ours. How they're folded. So there's that, and I think the act of unfolding, where things, mountains have folds, and as you come up over a ridge and the landscape unfolds before you, you don't know what you're going to find. So there's a sense of surprise and possibility, of non-linearity, and I think the same in a conversation kind of unfolds, and it could go many ways, a conversation like this or any satisfying conversation, but always to more possibility. And I think that for me, that's the bit that makes me feel most alive, is that sense of like something could unfold here and I don't know what it is. And funnily enough, I think part of that is a non-attachment to outcomes. So I think part of that is, one of the things that I run is a kind of, I don't know what to call it even, but a kind of community, a group, I guess, called Yellow. And we began that in the pandemic, and it's taken many different forms as time has unfolded. But I think one of the things we've always been doing is saying, hey, this might die tomorrow. So I think there's this kind of, the non-attachment is to be willing to accept that one of the things that might unfold, might mean this thing ends. And that's okay too, because then that can allow something else to unfold. And that all feels so different to me to the clinging on, whether it's the clinging on to material, the bits of myself that I don't like are the bits that are very clingy and want things to stick and stay and be how I want them to be. And that feels kind of deathly. It feels, in relationships, it's deathly because I'm kind of control what someone else does. Don't say that, do that. I don't like it when you do that. That, as opposed to kind of like, who are you? Or who are you today? Actually, would be an even better question. And so I think it's that sense of kind of unfolding possibility, and a lot of the things I've been talking about are kind of implicit in that. And I think that's what I think life writ large has been doing. It's been for 3 billion years or so on this planet, at least. It's been going, hey, what can we do here? And there are big flips along the way. So I love the fact that, there was, for 2 billion of that 3 billion years, oxygen was poisonous to everything that was alive on the planet, until one day, kind of somehow, through some flip or mutation or happenstance, life finds a way to use what was previously a toxin in order to fuel what then becomes the most kind of abundant and proliferative phase of life, and an explosion of possibility, And so, yeah, I think that's for me what feels kind of alive, that unfolding, which involves the not knowing.
Well, Rob, I think for anyone listening, your sense of almost an insatiable curiosity, and also just the freshness which you seem to be interpreting or engaging with life, the freshness of those eyes as well is really, really enjoyable to engage with. So just thank you so much for joining us today on the What is a Good Life podcast, and I continue to look forward to more engagements.
Me too, Mark. Great to talk with you. Thanks so much.